Good morning, everybody. We'll be just getting started in a moment. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us this morning in the first of our governance series, where we're going to be talking about key roles on your digital project. So talking all about how to lead your project team to success. Just quickly about Hart Square, we're a consultancy practice, and really our main drivers are all about enabling digital and change capabilities within the not-for-profit sector. As you can see, we have lots of years of experience and hope that helps with some of the topics that we're going to talk about today. So just some housekeeping rules. Just say that the session is being recorded and it will be available on demand afterwards. You'll see there's a Q&A box, and that's for any questions that you have for myself or Jason. And we really do want this to be as interactive as possible. So please put your questions in throughout the session and we will endeavour to answer as many of them as we can going through. You'll see there's also a chat box that's really for any more technical or support questions. And my lovely colleague Alan is in the background and he'll be keeping an eye on those. So I'm Joyce Harman, I'm Head of Client Services at Hart Square, and I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague Jason. Jason, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. My name's Jason Marshall. I'm a business change consultant here at Hart Square. I've been in the IT industry for about a decade now, most of which has been in the not-for-profit sector. I've been involved in projects of all shapes and sizes, all the way from small proof of concepts to multi-year implementation projects. And looking through the roles we're going to talk about today, I've actually played probably most of them, all the way from software developer up to and across to project sponsor. So really excited to talk about this topic today with Joyce.
Perfect. And you can see why we invited Jason along this morning with all those many years of experience in the various different roles. So I'm just going to launch a quick poll to just kind of get an understanding of, who's with us this morning and sort of what stage you're at. So Alan, if you could bring that up, thank you. So what we're looking at is sort of the key challenges in digital projects, kind of where are you? So if you could just quickly, put in where you are. So you're internally, there's resistance to looking at new projects or change, that there's issues around the resources, how are you going to deliver the project, the ability to focus on the day job. We all know that projects take an awful long time, but people have busy day jobs. Senior management buy-in, there's a lack of that, or understanding what the roles are required on the project, or is it something else? So I'm just going to give that another second. And interesting in the lead at the minute is the resources and the ability to focus on the day job. So probably no surprise there. Great. So Alan, if you could share the results, please. So interestingly, the resources to deliver the project has come up as kind of the highest percentage, closely followed by, the focusing on the day job. But interestingly, resistance to change of the project or lack of senior management buy-in, kind of equal. So I think it's quite interesting. Jason, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm interested that I was expecting to see a few more ticks on the understanding of roles, because I think that sometimes leads into the resources kind of required to deliver the project. And certainly we're going to talk quite a lot about the different roles throughout the presentation that follows. But yeah, I think I'm not surprised to see the ability to focus on the day job alongside projects high up there. I suppose in a way that the two top ones are quite interlinked, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. But and I think, yeah, to your point about the understanding the roles, actually very often it's to understand the roles is thinking about the resources. Do you have the resource to then figure out what the right roles are? Perfect. So Alan, if we can stop sharing that, and then so Jason, I'm going to hand over to you to start talking about sort of the roles framework.
Lovely. Thanks, Joyce. So I always think in these sorts of sessions, it's really useful to have a framework which we can talk to. So I think about project roles in terms of a continuum between strategic and operational, where people on the left are thinking exclusively in that sort of strategic mindset, people on the right much more operational, what's going on. So if we look at then the on the left is our leadership. So they're principally focused on the why. So why this project? Why should we do it now? Why should we spend money on this project? On the complete other end of that is our delivery colleagues who are focused on the how. So how will things change as a result of this project? How will it work? How will it be possible? Using their operational in-depth knowledge of what's going on. And then in the middle, we've got the management team who are bringing those two groups together to focus on the what. So what is it? What is it going to cost? And what is the delivery timeline? So then the next bit is about the factors for success. So anyone who's spent any time in project management will be very familiar with what I've got up on screen here in terms of the sometimes called, I think, the iron pyramid of project management. So these are the interdependent factors that you need to manage at the operational level of a project to create success. So in the center of the pyramid is quality. So that's kind of at the heart of what we're doing when we're trying to deliver a project. We want to create some quality outcomes which will meet business needs. And I think the interesting thing about quality, particularly thinking about operations, is it's very much in the eye of the beholder. It's difficult sometimes to describe what is good enough, and I think that causes projects issues sometimes in terms of being able to be comfortable that something has hit a quality threshold. But the reason I think it's on the operational end of the continuum is it's the people who are using it who really understand the business processes and the change that's required, who are best able to define and kind of intuit what that quality standard is. And wrapped around that and interdependent with it is the scope. So, how much of it are we going to do? What is the cost of the project, and what are the timelines? And from an operational perspective, when we talk about risk, operational risk, it's often within respect of cost, time, scope, and quality. So, as I say, I think you'll all probably be very familiar with that model. The model that we're presenting now on the left is a more strategic viewpoint on project management. And the factors that we're presenting here are very similar, complementary, but also different. So in the center, we've got business value. And I think that's related to quality. But I think where I said quality is very hard to define, is very much subjective in the eye of the beholder. I think business value is much more measurable. It's thinking about the project in terms of the capability that the project will bring to your organization, the opportunities it might bring, and tying that to your organizational key performance indicators. So thinking about a CRM system, for example, the business value of a new CRM system might be to enable growth, and to do so by creating efficiencies in, say, the management team, for example, which are quite measurable factors, much so different to the quality, which is more about how that team will experience it. Then kind of allies to that is the idea of vision. So to what degree does the project align with the organization's vision, with the why are we doing this project? The risk, the organizational risk, which I think is different, it's bigger than the operational risk. So I'm thinking cybersecurity is a risk that you might find on an operational team's RAID log, but at a organizational level, that cybersecurity is much more focused on, well, what's the impact? What's the sort of reputational impact of a cyber event, versus at a project level, it's much more about what would we do to stop it? How would we get the data back? Those sorts of elements. And then lastly, and I think this is really key, particularly in terms of how we at Hart Square think about projects, is the idea of partnership. So you're not doing a project alone, you're doing it in partnership with other organizations. Typically, that will be a technology partner. And I think one of the roles of the leadership team in a project is to monitor and make sure that partnership is working. And on a long, large, complicated implementation, there are always kind of road bumps in the way in terms of the project progressing. And I think one of the things that the strategic end of the roles of a project is about focusing on, well, that withstanding, do we still have a good partnership? Do we still understand one another? Do we still care about one another's goals? So a very different mindset. And I think I sort of draw it out because I think it's really important to make sure that people in the roles are able to sort of think about it from those different mindsets. So then we'll now layer into this the actual roles. So Joyce is going to talk a little bit more about these in a moment. But in terms of the leadership roles, really we're talking about the project board, which is, I suppose, actually a group of roles. But the project sponsor, and I think the project sponsor is ultimately accountable for the delivery of the project. They're a really, really key role in any project. Some of these roles are duplicated, if you like. So you as the client organization will have a project sponsor, a senior member of the leadership team within the organization who's leading the project. But the tech partner will also have a project sponsor, again, a senior member of their team who is invested in the delivery of that project. And potentially, if you're working with Hart Square, we will have a sponsor as well for the same reasons. Over in the delivery side of things, on the right-hand side, the deeper blues are the roles that you would have in your organization as the client. So your subject matter experts, the people who know absolutely in depth exactly what goes on, how the business processes work, what's possible, what's going to work, everything about the change that's going to happen. They will work very closely with your champions. So champions in some instances can be the same person, so have that subject matter expertise, but the focus of that role is to be a sort of agent for change, to be going out at a grassroots level within the organization and talking about what is this project, what's it going to achieve, why should people be excited about it, and driving enthusiasm, but also, I guess, helping to gather the requirements and understanding what are the things that people really, really want. Because I guess the issue with subject matter experts is that sometimes they know they know it very well from their perspective, but it's good to get a broader sense. And Joyce, stop me if I'm stealing your thunder. I'm conscious I'm diving into this.
Absolutely fine.
This sort of the paler boxes on the right, the business analysts, the developers, the testers, those are typically tech partner roles. Generally that's how we see projects develop, although sometimes business analysts might sit within the client organization. But fundamentally, the business analysts are there to create and capture your functional and technical requirements. They build that into a specification. They hand that over to myself in a previous life, and I take that specification and I build it. I configure a platform, or I write code, or whatever it is I'm doing, and then I hand that on to the testers who make sure that I've done it right and that it's going to work and that it meets the underlying business requirement. And then you've got in the middle the management team. Again, really key group of people, and fundamentally the management team are there to bridge the gap between the leadership and the development, and be a kind of conduit of communications between those two groups of people. The business lead, again, in terms of the management team, it's the most important person, that they will be within your organization. They are responsible. If we say the project sponsor is accountable, the business lead is responsible for the project. And again, they may be to some degree a subject matter expert. They may really understand the problems, but actually in this particular space, they're playing a very different role. They're not focusing on necessarily the detail, but they are focusing on making sure the project happens. And actually, I think there's sometimes a risk where the business lead can know too much and can kind of slip into subject matter expert mode without recognizing. And yeah, I think what Joyce and I'll talk more about that in sort of subsequent slides, but I'm kind of wanted to call it out there. The project manager works really, really closely with the business lead. The project manager is there really to coordinate and be the sort of the right-hand person for the business lead to make sure the project runs smoothly. That's a role that I play a lot at the moment in terms of making sure that the project is on track, that we understand the budgets, we are understanding scope, all of the kind of the stuff that I mentioned in that first pyramid. Change manager. Not all projects will have a change manager. It kind of depends upon your size and scale and the breadth of that change, but certainly the change manager effectively coordinates the champions. So they are there to help manage the change, to understand what needs to be done within the organization to create the space and criteria for that, the environment for that change to happen. Data and technical lead. So again, those will be depending upon the technical complexities of your project, but your technical lead will understand how the technology works within your organization. The data lead obviously will understand your data, and they are there to represent those needs within the project, particularly to make sure that the developers and business analysts understand it and that the wider needs of the organization are brought in. And then the last one on the slide is product owner, and actually that caused a bit of controversy, didn't it, Joyce, between us as we were kind of talking about these slides. So from my perspective, I think that the product owner is a tech partner role, and not necessarily one that they will always have, but some tech partners will own a product. They are configuring a product for you, and they may be developing that product to a certain degree for you as well. And to my mind, the product owner's role is to work very closely with the business analysts within the tech partner to represent and own that product and to sort of make key decisions about how that product might need to flex and bend in order to meet the needs of the client. And Joyce, I don't know, did you want to sort of?
Yeah, I think, I completely agree with that. I think, but the point I was making when we were discussing it is saying that from a product owner, there must be somebody internal client side who's going to take responsibility for that product. For example, if it's a CRM, not just during that implementation phase, but really importantly at the post go live, because somebody has to be responsible for making sure that the system is being used, that the governance is in place, and that people are not going off and working off system and all of those kind of things, so that they understand if further development work is done, and they're really the champion for that. Sometimes, again, it could be called, the CRM project owner. It could, the various different names it can be, but it's from my point of view, it's absolutely on the technology partner side, there's a product owner, but very much identifying, thinking about internally, client side, who could that be? And ideally, you want it to be the same person through implementation, going into post go live and making sure that people use the system. So it's one of those points that I always think is kind of really important.
That's really interesting, Josh. I'd not thought about that in terms of the idea of how these roles morph as they go through the project, and then when the project finishes, what becomes of them. So just listening to your description there, to my mind, I wonder whether or not there's a natural progression from the business lead within the within the project, who is very much playing that kind of product owner type role within the project, in terms of that their focus is on making sure that product works for their organization. I wonder if there is almost that kind of, but that business lead role morphs into or becomes the sort of internal product owner, kind of as the project closes down and goes into business as usual.
Yeah, no, definitely, and it's also it's kind of, and again, we'll come on to this in some of the other slides, but equally on the change manager, it's once the system's gone live, you still have to engage people. And so therefore, is that the same person who is responsible for change and implementation, or does it change over? So it's always, you know, when thinking of projects, you can't just think of them in isolation of just the implementation phase. That's, you know, that's the getting the system in, and it's an awful lot of hard work. But, you know, you need to then get all the benefits out of the system after all of that hard work. So thinking about some of these roles, where do they shift post go live? Is it the same person? Does the role change slightly? And obviously the cadence of work changes because you've gone live and all that kind of thing. But it's definitely something to work considering when you're thinking of the project roles, you know, at the start of the project.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, yeah, just sort of popped into my mind is that idea of the project for those people that are involved is quite a transformative thing. It's a real kind of quite significant learning and development experience. And kind of, yeah, thinking about how you develop people within these roles throughout the course of the project and kind of where it leads them next, again, is an interesting consideration that I kind of not thought about particularly before this.
Yeah, and then just to say, we've got some great questions coming in, so we will get to them shortly.
Super.
Perfect. So it's good to just move on.
Great. Thanks, Joyce. Yeah, so what then, in terms of the model I wanted to illustrate is this idea of role groups. So up to this point, I've talked about the sort of the operational strategic perspective. But I think if you drew a line straight down the middle of that continuum, then you've got your project team, which should be a familiar term for everyone. Those are everyone that sits on the right-hand side of that. And the project team are really responsible for the operational decisions of the project, the day-to-day. What are we going to do? How are we going to respond to problems? How will we manage operational risk? And often that is within the bounds of delegated authority. So the project board will say to the project team, you know, within the bounds of this budget level or within these sorts of scope changes, you're free to make your own decisions, and you can report that back to us as a board later on. So within the project team are all of your delivery staff, but also it overlaps then with the management team. So the management team are a de facto part of the project team, but they're also part of the other group up here on the slide, the project board. So the project board differ from the project team in the sense that they maintain strategic oversight, but they aren't involved in the day-to-day delivery of the project in any sense. So they do make decisions, but those are sort of, I guess, you know, higher level strategic decisions in terms of overall budgets, overall scope. And again, kind of thinking about the second pyramid that I discussed in an earlier slide, it's within reference to business value that those decisions tend to get made. But fundamentally, that group, led by the project sponsor, is ultimately accountable for the delivery of the project, in the sense that, yeah, they are the ones that are leading it internally compared to the operational project team who are responsible for the delivery of it. And again, as I've said a few times, the management team that sits in the middle of that plays a really, really important role. And I think it's sort of key to pull out here. Therefore, they need to have the appropriate skill set, but they're playing a kind of translation role. They need to be able to understand and to see the strategic elements of the project. They need to understand what the business value is, what the vision is, and translate that into operational terms, to influence and represent the board when making those operational decisions. Then there's a communication element. The leadership aren't involved in the operations, and the delivery team aren't involved in the higher level decision making. So the right bits of information need to pass through, and certainly, yeah, the challenge often is trying to distill down all of the operational chatter from a project into what are the key things that the leadership team need to be aware of. And I think that's can be very uncomfortable for people sometimes in terms of what are the bits you leave out in terms of a project context. And it sometimes can feel like, are we by leaving this out, are we misleading people? But there's a real skill in being able to go, no, that's an operational concern. We'll deal with that in the project, but that thing is too big, or it impacts the things that the project board care about, and therefore we need to make the project board aware of that. And that's, I would say, a real kind of constant dialogue between the members of the management team, kind of led by the business lead, and conversations with the project manager, the change manager, or all of the individuals in that team should have an influence over the messaging that flows up to the project board, but also the information that comes back down in terms of how the project board are perceiving the project, what the challenges are organizationally that impact the project. And then finally, I think there's an advocacy element to that as well. I think, again, in terms of summarizing and making sure the right information goes to the board, it's really important to give the board a real an idea of the delivery team, what they're able to achieve. Actually, that it is pretty hard. That there are significant challenges that are being overcome, and that those things shouldn't be taken lightly. And needs to be recognised and talked about by the project leadership. And again, I think that can be a difficult one. It can often take a back seat, perhaps, to the trickier parts of the project, but making sure people, particularly in the operational teams, feel heard, understood, valued, and are motivated to continue, often through quite hard parts of the project. That's a really core part of your management team. And again, I think that's a really key set of skills, and it's something that not everyone has, and needs to be developed and nurtured and kind of cultured. And Joyce, I think we'll talk about that a bit more in sort of the next few slides. So I think really all I have left on this is just to bring it together on the final slide, just to pull it all into one place, and just to sort of say that the framework really is at the top, with that continuum of different perspectives, and recognizing that there's a strategic versus an operational mindset, recognizing those role groups in terms of the project board and the project team, and the individual roles within that, and finally those two pyramids which represent the different focuses that those different groups of roles need to maintain in order to kind of create success in the project.
Perfect. Thank you, Jason. So really just to delve into some of these in a bit more detail. So, looking on the delivery side of things, as Jason has pointed out, you've got your internal kind of what we would say client side roles, which are very much the champions, the subject matter experts, or SMEs as they're often referred to. And then on the technology partner side, sort of that more developers and the business analysts. But really, the important point around this delivery team, and the point about all of this leadership, management and delivery, is just that they're teams that have very distinct roles in the project. But the delivery team is there to engage with the project. It's really making sure that the different areas that are being tested, that are going to be finally delivered, are they fit for purpose? Are they going to deliver to you as a client what you actually need, what you're expecting? That, when you were going through discovery and all of that, are you getting what you expect to get, and will it actually work for the individual teams? And so it's the champions are really, really important, that they're kind of helping with testing that to make sure that works. And looking at your subject matter experts. And again, as Jason has said, sometimes they can be so focused on their areas, but it's making sure that when you look at who you're going to appoint as subject matter experts, that you get a good spread across, what the project's going to be for. Is it, for example, if it's a CRM, is it an organizational wide CRM? So therefore, looking at who your subject matter experts, what departments and areas should they be in? Or is it just it's a system that's more focused on, say, fundraising and comms? So again, thinking about who your subject matter experts should be around that, because all of the people within this team are going to be making sure that everything's tested, everything's signed off. And very often what you see with projects like this is there will be a lot of business process change, either due to wanting to bring in better efficiencies or due to the way that the technology is going to be developed. So making sure that the new processes that are being put in place as part of this new project, do the work, and making sure they're being tested properly. So Jason, just one question that comes up an awful lot for me when I'm talking to people is, are any of these roles that can kind of be shared? I'm going to be asking that question on the other slides as well, but is there, for you kind of, I think, client side, particularly around champion subject matter experts, are these roles that can be shared, or they're very much separate?
Yeah, I think there's definite crossover and overlapping of skills, particularly with the subject matter experts. I suppose in a way, to be a champion of a project, you've got to understand what the change is, why that change is valuable, what the kind of as is situation is. But I think where it's different is you've got to be able to articulate that. You've got to be able to go and show some excitement about that. You've got to go and maybe have some difficult conversations with people who aren't excited about it. So I think, yes, a champion can be a subject matter expert, but they are kind of different skills. So yeah, the SME is about detail. It's about understanding what this thing is, making sure that the end result is going to work, and being very, very detail focused. I think that's quite key. And I think it doesn't always follow that mindset lends itself to being able to talk and articulate why something is valuable. So I think that's really the differentiator, is if you've got a person who can do both of those things, yeah, absolutely. I think they can be shared.
Yeah.
The caveat of that being, do they have the time to do both of those things? And I think possibly with this, you get that there's phases of this, isn't there? The SMEs are very busy at the start in the requirements, and then perhaps less involved until UAT, and at which point they can flip into kind of champion mode.
Yeah, I think that, that's a really good point, and we do have a slide coming up later thinking about sort of the levels of busyness, for want of a better word, at different stages on the project. And I completely agree to your point about the champions. A lot of it comes down to personality, which when we talk about sort of change and change management, you have to be able to engage with people. It needs to be somebody that can get people excited and interested, so I agree with you. I think that's an important part.
Yeah.
So then want to move on to looking at kind of, who are your stakeholders. So Jason, if you wanted to kind of talk through this one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're going to build on this idea of stakeholder management, and it's really jumping off from the idea of the champion. What have they got ahead of them in terms of how do they kind of create change and identify who to talk to. So this is one of many different models out there for identifying stakeholders. It's one that I've used quite a lot, and what it does is to position individuals in the organization against two axes. So you've got I should get this right, the y-axis. I come from a science background, I must remember that. So that's the power axis. So to what degree do these individuals have the ability to influence and make decisions about the project? So do they have budgetary control? Are they able to make decisions about scope, for example? And then on the x-axis, how interested are they? And that sometimes can be misconstrued. I think it's about how invested is that individual in the success of the project. So you could argue that on a day-to-day basis, the project sponsor isn't particularly interested in the project. They're not monitoring it every second of every day, but by gosh, they are very much invested in the delivery of it. They are being ultimately accountable. So one of the roles of the champion and the change lead, as Joyce will talk about in a minute, is identifying where do people sit in that continuum? So top right, high interest, high power, those are your key players. Those represent most of the project team and certainly the board. So you would manage them closely. They're involved. You know, they are day to day, week to week in the project. Your active players are less involved. Maybe they're sort of brought into the project team from time to time to do work. You want to make sure that they're informed though, because they're really interested and they'll get frustrated if they don't know what's going on. To the bottom left, your spectators, those are people, it's kind of everyone else that's not part of the project. Everyone in the organization is on this matrix somewhere, and the bulk will be in spectators. So they won't be particularly interested until something happens, that they won't have an awful lot of decision-making power. But I think the idea here is to monitor them and to go, well, hold on, they could suddenly become, get promoted and become an influential observer. So at which point you need to be making sure you understand what they think about the project, and where their new influence, new power might be brought to bear. And that leads us lastly to the kind of influential observers. So those that aren't hugely invested in the project, but have the power to make budget decisions, to influence people who do have budget decisions. And within a large organization, there's lots of different factors that are competing for budget and time. So really the focus here is keeping those individuals satisfied and aligned, if not engaged, in your project.
Perfect. I really like the term spectators because it really sums it up. Absolutely.
Doesn't it? Yeah, it's quite evocative. You can sort of, that big group of people just watching.
Exactly, as you say, waiting for something to happen, and then they'll get involved. So then moving on to sort of looking at that management layer, and really, really important, as we kind of touched on, sort of looking at the business lead and their role. And I think one of the big things for me, and again a question that comes up an awful lot, is a business lead somebody that could be brought in externally? And the answer is simply no. A business lead has to be somebody who is in the organization, and ideally somebody who's been with the organization for a while, because we have had on various different projects, and I'm sure that Jason will know as well, where somebody has literally just joined the organization and they're put in the role of business lead, but they're still learning about the organization. They're still trying to understand the nuances of personalities, how things work, politics, all of those kind of things. And they don't have that history of the organization. And so it makes it a very, very challenging role for them. It's not to say it can't work, but really it's one of those roles that it's really important that it's somebody internally who's got a really good understanding of the organization, and equally importantly can make decisions quickly. So doesn't have to be all final decisions, but decisions that will mean the project doesn't stall and doesn't get delayed. So it's a really, really important role.
And Joyce, on that, I think it's emphasizing the influence that project lead needs to have, business lead needs to have. They might not always have the final decision making in terms of a budget or whatever, but they need to have that really rich network within the organization within which to influence and kind of move people around that matrix we just talked about.
Yeah, and I think you're right. They're a key influencer. That's really what it comes down to. They're a key influencer on the project. And then moving over, thinking about that change manager, as Jason said, not everybody will have sort of a dedicated change manager on the project, but there should be somebody who's sort of responsible for change. They might not have the full title of change manager, but basically it's around engagement on the project, getting people excited, getting people bought in, understanding and looking at either people or departments where there might be a bit more resistant to change, what needs to be done around that, and planning that all together. We'll come to another slide in a minute talking a bit more detail about stakeholder management. And then obviously project manager, one of my favorite topics that I'll always talk about, how a project manager is absolutely not just a diary manager. And it is not a joke. Honestly, people do say that to me all the time. Your project manager is there to drive your project. They're responsible for your project plan. They're looking after your risk register. They're getting your project initiation document done. They're there to push you as a client. They're there to push you, the tech partners, to keep this project going. So it's a really, really, really key role. on that. And Jason, I do have some questions for you on that in a second. And then thinking about that data and technical lead, and I know that Jason's touched on this briefly, but data is one of these things that often gets forgotten about in projects. And we do have a data series, so if you haven't seen that, sign up for that, because we could talk about it all day long. But really important thinking about that data technical lead. Have they got the right skills? It might even sound on a really basic level from a data point of view. Can they use Excel? What are you doing with, how you're going to transform that data? Very basic levels of, have they got the right skills? Can they make data decisions? All of that kind of stuff. So really thinking about that, it's really important, because this sort of management lean, this management layer, is all about monitoring the progress on the project, getting everybody bought in, driving things forward to make sure that you're all heading in the right direction together. But I suppose, Jason, from your point of view, level of experience that's kind of required in these different roles, do you think that there's definite skill sets that must have, or people can kind of learn some more of them on the job?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because I think it depends upon the scale of the project. In a past life, I taught students project management, and they would go and manage projects, and you're delivering to them a core set of skills and tools within which to do that. And I think that, coming to your point about diary management, often you can see them as quite transactional, in terms of they manage diaries, they'll put a raid log together, they'll do a plan. But actually, I think, coming back to the framework that I was describing, they sit in the middle of that boundary between strategic and operational, and they need to be able to have both viewpoints. And I think that's even more important in larger projects. So I suppose long answer to a succinct question, but I think there are levels within project management, and certainly you need to be able to develop someone within the project management kind of role. So if it is someone that doesn't have an awful lot of strategic kind of management experience, that's something you would need to nurture. The project sponsor and the business lead would need to support that role. But I am I'm keen that people can be developed. They don't just get born as sort of fully functional project managers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just conscious of time, but I just quickly wanted to ask you, because the project manager role can be an internal project manager, or you bring in an external project manager. If you're bringing in an external project manager, is there a kind of a key thing that needs to be considered on bringing them in? But a quick short answer on that one.
I suppose when you're bringing in someone external, you're bringing them in because they've got that experience. You're not there to develop that individual. So I think it's making sure that they can very quickly embed themselves within your project team and be effective, without having to go through all the bringing them on board and developing them, which you might an internal candidate.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so going to move on then to really just looking at stakeholder management. And we've kind of touched on a lot of this already, but it's such an important part in the project, because you can't do a project at people, you have to do a project with people. And it's a mantra I'm a big believer in. So really kind of thinking about, if you're going to have a change manager, who is that internally? How much time are they going to be given for that? But equally, if you don't have a dedicated change manager, who's going to be the people, because this could be a shared role, that is going to drive this forward. So thinking about your project, at the start, it sounds very obvious, but identifying your stakeholders. Think about, what is the type project? Is it an organizational wide project? Is it just a couple of departments project? So making sure you know who your key stakeholders are. Going back to that grid of Jason's, and thinking about, what does that look like? Engaging with them, but thinking about, how do they need to be engaged with? Every organization is different, every team is different. So thinking about, what are the ways that you're going to do that, and putting a proper plan in place, or in some cases putting a communications plan in place. Now, that can be in many different levels. It can be very simple and basic, or it can be as complicated as you want. But really what you're trying to outline is understanding, who is it you need to engage with? How are you going to engage with them? What are the kind of different milestones in the project? Because it shouldn't just be the start of the project going, hey, we're doing this project, and then talking about them at the end. thinking about the different phases of the project, kind of linking it to your project plan with your project manager. What are the key milestones, particularly around testing and all of that kind of stuff? What other communication and things that people need? And then importantly, that this plan should not be shelfware. You need to be constantly going back to it. You need to be constantly reviewing it. Is it working? Is it not? Because it's really, really important. And I suppose, Jason, just quickly from your side, thinking about sort of different, cultures within organizations, is there a kind of a key takeaway from your point, thinking about that engagement piece?
Yeah, well, I suppose, it needs to be tuned to your organizational culture, doesn't it? It's difficult for myself as an external person coming into a project to know how best to communicate to your organization. I'm not embedded enough to know. So I think you know at that bit where it goes beyond planning and into actual communications, it needs to be flavored. It needs to be tuned to your audiences, and you as an organization will know that better.
Yeah, absolutely. So then moving on to then leadership. So, as Jason said, I won't go through this in a lot of detail because Jason covered a lot of it already, but thinking about that, that project board and your project sponsor. So the leadership team, they're responsible to make sure the resources that are needed on the project are available, that they give sign off, they agree to, the budget, they agree to the timelines, they agree if there's going to be any changes in scope, all of that kind of thing. But it's really important that the leadership team champions the project, that they are really pushing it, internally to say, this is a priority for us as an organization and why, so that there's no hiding away from this project. It is front and center of everybody's mind, and they're there to support the team. But yes, was Jason, really just wanted to kind of bring in quickly, thinking about that board, typically who sort of is on the board, or who do you think should be on the board?
Well, yeah, I guess there's the people we've mentioned in terms of the project management team, which would join the sponsor to form sort of almost an operational part of that board. But I think when you're thinking about those influential observers, so those people who are not day to day paying attention to the project, but have power to control it, I think bringing them into the board is a really good way of helping them engage, becoming more actively invested, but also providing a broader set of ideas and understanding of how the project is going to influence the organization. So we often refer to them as kind of sort of senior users, so people in the organization who are going to be using whatever the output of the project is, but may not be directly involved. I think considering that audience and how you keep them engaged throughout the life cycle of the project, and whether or not they come in for certain parts and they're sort of guests of the board rather than de facto board members.
Yeah, absolutely, completely agree. So then I just want to move on to sometimes when this slide goes up, people kind of go, oh, this is terrifying. But just to really sort of highlight it, because again, a question that comes up. So we've kind of outlined the different roles on the project, but what does that actually look like on a project? So a caveat, every different project has different levels of complexity and different length. But this is kind of what we see typically on projects. So looking at sort of the level of involvement, if it's high level involvement or medium to low level involvement, the difference between the part about, so it's days per week on if this is internal people. So for example, the difference between if you have an internal project manager, because they will have other responsibilities within the organization, it's a full-time job. Whereas if you bring in an external project manager, they're really just sort of 2 to 3 days a week, because the only thing they're focusing on is your project, and they're not involved in sort of the business as usual side of things. Importantly, looking at that business lead, and again on the subject matter experts, to the point, they cannot be external people. So there's at different stages of projects, these cadences of time will change. But I suppose the important point is really to show that projects are not easy and they take a lot of time. So when you're thinking about these different roles and who they're going to be, really think about the person, think about their business as usual activities, their skill levels, and all of these things, because it's really, really important. So then just conscious of time, because I do want to get some questions. So really just sort of to summarize, sort of bringing it all together. So Jason.
Yeah, so again, I think this slide is designed to give you the whole model in one place. And I think the point I want to make is that I've made it a few times already, this idea of the management team being a conduit that brings the two different parts of that project together. And they're really, really key, and they have to be able to perform in those roles. It's a real key success factor. So it's picking the right people and supporting them is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, I think for me, just be careful about the individuals, that you're not giving them too many roles, because that's absolutely where things can go wrong on the project.
And exactly that. I think one of the leading parts in the polls was, how do we balance business as usual with project responsibility? And it's really hard. And it's really important to provide backfill and almost not to be tempted to overload people with too many roles, to give them the space to deliver.
Absolutely. And then really finally, it's an organizational wide project. The whole organization has to be involved in the project, and that's really important. So just to say, so I'm going to go over to the Q&A session, but also just to say there will be a survey at the end. So please, if you could fill that in. So one question that's come in is, what methods do you find most effective when, for example, an IT stakeholder and a business stakeholder have conflicting views? What is affecting this survivability of a project? Thoughts, Jason?
Oh, wow. I mean, I suppose it depends upon the nature of the problem. I'll caveat my response to begin with. I think that's often a board discussion. If I'm understanding the question correctly, if there's a conflict of some description between the client and the tech partner, I think if that can't be neatly resolved in conversation at the project team, that then becomes an issue that you would escalate up to the project board. And sometimes that's something that you would actively discuss as part of an agendaed item in a monthly board meeting, and it's enough to deal with it then. Other times, we've certainly had success in the past of kind of breaking out elements of the project board to focus on that as an issue. Sometimes we've called those sponsors meetings, where we bring together the project sponsor from the client, the tech partner, and sometimes from a Hart Square perspective, we're there to mediate that conversation. So it's sort of like another level of escalation within the board, but doesn't take up the bandwidth of the whole board to deal with. And often I find I have seen those types of sessions work really well.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question we've come in, and I might just go back on the slide. So of the three variables on the quality triangle, which is the one that's the hardest to manage in your experience? Is it useful, Jason, for me to go back on that?
Oh yeah, if you go back a couple, well, no, I can see it on screen. So scope, cost, and time. I mean, they're fundamentally if I would say actually the hardest one to manage directly is quality, because you can't define it very well. As a sort of project manager, you can say what is in scope, you can understand the costs and the time, but it's how those three interdependent factors come together to form a quality outcome of the project. And I think that can often lead projects astray in the pursuit of quality. And I suppose one of the things that I've worked on a lot with clients is trying to define quality and knowing when it is good, because whatever the outcome will be, will never be perfect. So it's almost, I suppose, to answer the question, I think it's about giving enough detail in the scope where you can, so that you can know when you've done scope to an acceptable level of quality, and otherwise you end up pouring more time and money into the pursuit of perfection, which is not the road you want to go down.
No, absolutely. It's an interesting question. Are there
Yeah.
any roles that you think would have a big impact if they were to leave the organization during the project?
So I would personally, and Joyce, you'll have opinions on this, but I think the business lead is probably the kind of the critical, pivotal, keystone role. And I think because my comment earlier around, they need to have a really rich network of influence in order to be able to perform in that role. So it's really hard if that business lead who is leading the day-to-day project leaves mid-project, it's really hard to kind of pick up from where they left off in terms of the context and direction of the project from an operational perspective. But it's then, do you recruit someone in and how do they perform that role versus do you find someone else who has similar influence, but how do they fill that person's shoes? Yeah, I don't know. What did you think, Joyce? Is there other roles?
I agree with you. Business lead is so critical on the project, that a business lead leaving mid project is definitely a challenge. I think, which actually kind of ties into another question that's come in, which I'll explain my thinking on it. So the other question was, can you be more specific about which roles can't be held by the same person and help us to understand why? So I'm going to sort of flip that to answer it. So in some organizations, so ideally in an organization, the business lead would be one person. But we have had situations before due to capacity, internally with clients, which is quite normal capacity issues, they're always a problem, that a business lead can be a shared role. It's not ideal, but it is possible. But again, it's that bit around making sure there's clear understanding of how that shared role is going to work and all of that kind of thing. But I suppose on the flip side of that question, then answering it, what roles cannot be held by the same person? And I'm glad by the prompt question, because we forgot to mention this. Another question we get asked all the time is around the project sponsor and the project lead. Can they just be the same person? And the answer is absolutely not. They're very, very distinct roles. There's very clear delineation of sort of responsibilities. And that and because it is a conversation that happens a lot, and I know Jason will be aware of this as well, is around they have to be clearly different. Jason, any thoughts on that just quickly before we wrap up?
I mean, yeah, firstly, I completely agree. It's really hard to do both roles. And I would, there's some projects I've worked on where that thing around quality versus business value has caused conflict, and actually you need the sponsor and the business lead to be able to represent those two factors, and ultimately to make a decision about, do we continue to increase the quality, or do we accept what it does right now because it does actually deliver the business value? And I think you can't have that conversation in your own head. That needs to be two people representing those different sides of those sort of pyramids.
Yeah, absolutely. So just really, I suppose, to wrap up and to say thank you. Unfortunately, we haven't got through all of the questions, but very happy to follow up with any of those separately. And as I said, the recording will be available afterwards. So please, do have a look at that or come back with any questions. And then also you'll see there'll be a survey sent out. So please, if you could fill that in, just because it really helps us to see where we can improve, or equally if there's any other topics that you'd like us to cover. So I'd just like to say thank you everybody for joining us, but most importantly, thank you, Jason. Wonderful as always. And hopefully we will see you all again, either on our data series, which is the challenges of data. I would recommend you look at it, or on one of our other upcoming governance series events. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day, everybody.
Take care, bye.